Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about things we learned about the MBE when creating an MBE course. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about what we learned about the MBE from making a course on it and spending lots of time with these questions. I'm not sure we understood how much time we'd be spending with these questions when we started this, but we spent a lot of time with the MBE questions. And I'll be honest, I hadn't really sat down with a bunch of MBE questions since I took my second bar exam, and that was a while ago. So it was really eye-opening for me to go through all of these questions. We did 5 in each of the subject areas for a video, and then we picked 5 matching practice questions. So that's, it's a lot of questions. 70 questions total. And some of them we even had to write because there are not that many Civ Pro questions out there. So, we went over each topic area really carefully, and we had to explain questions on all different types of legal issues. So we learned some stuff.
Yeah, we did. And, this is totally what happens if you ever have dreams of creating online content, is we come up with these great ideas and we're always like, this will be, really straightforward and easy. And then, months into this project,
we're like, wait, how many questions are we going to talk about? Because that seems like a lot of stuff.
I know, we've got our whole team working on it.
Yeah, but we literally had all of our elves in the workshop, going through their individual questions. Because even just to pick the questions, we tried to cover things that were heavily tested. Well, then how do you find out what's heavily tested? How do you match up these questions, et cetera, et cetera. So, although the first thing I learned was actually quite interesting, and that was that none of these questions individually are actually impossible.
I think that is a really important lesson, because I think a lot of times when folks start reading MBE questions, they just want to throw up their hands and be like, I cannot study for this thing. It's too hard.
Well, exactly. And I think, somebody like me who's good at taking standardized tests, that was a really hard test even for me. And so I just thought, there's certain questions I would literally just never be able to answer.
Right.
And that's not actually true. What these questions require in order to answer them, however, is a very, very detailed knowledge of the law.
Oh, yeah. I know. I was recording the question on the wrap.
Oh, God.
Oh, yeah. That was... For those of you who take this course, that video was 17 minutes long.
Yeah, the average video in this course is probably like 5 to 7.
Maybe like 7 to 10.
Yeah.
But this one was 17 minutes because, that law is just really dense. And I have a pretty good, structural understanding of future interests. I've taught it a bunch of times. I've tutored a bunch of people in it. But it's like going through that law still, it almost gives you heart palpitations, because you're just like defeasible fee, the contingent remainder subject to divestment. Like you can't even say, I had to practice saying some of the words because you don't say them out loud very often. But one of the things that I think even that question, which is a laborious question to get through,
and gave both of us a very big headache.
Yeah, because then I had to be like, we need some slide magic to happen to this. We had charts. But the thing that I think that I really learned from that, even going through that question in detail, is once you sit down again with the wrap and you really lay out the law and learn it, these questions are actually not that hard.
Right. Well, that's the whole thing. Some of this law seems so overwhelming and so crazy and so intimidating. And sometimes people do just throw up their hands and say, you know what, I'm just going to skip these questions. Mm-hmm. But, you can't skip that many, and there's kind of nasty law in a lot of different topic areas. Yeah. So sometimes this stuff that seems so impossible, if you actually take the time. I rember I have a chart of all the future interests that I drew out on one piece of paper. And when you do that, you can start to remember it and say, okay, I remember, all right, there's this crazy language about this defeasible whatever. You memorize that stuff. I remember having a red outline of the things that are subject to the rule against perpetuities. And, so if I can recreate that chart in my head and kind of go through it step by step with these questions, you can actually get to the answer pretty easily.
And because the law is so cumbersome, I think even some of the wrap questions are very straightforward because they don't have to be that complicated.
Right, exactly. They just assume that people are not going to know the law here.
Yeah.
So they don't test. I mean, some of the other topic areas, they're testing trickier ways of doing the question and things like that. But a lot of like the really nasty law stuff is actually pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but the really testing is maybe
did you learn this?
Did you learn, what types of future interests the RAP applies to?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I can envision this chart and I'm pretty sure there are 3 of them. Mm-hmm. It's like you just have to know what they are.
Exactly.
And what does that mean?
Right.
And a lot of the a lot of the property stuff is just, the terrible language. It's just like feudal England, basically.
It's terrible. I think mortgages is the same thing. I remember, I didn't study mortgages in my 1L year. I think most people didn't. And so when I saw those questions, I don't think I really spent any time trying to wrestle with that material. So every mortgage question sent me into a panicked meltdown.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those on the exam.
I swear there were more than 1/5 of the real property questions on my test because I felt like every other question was a mortgage question.
Yeah, but some of this, you just have to sit down and be like, okay, there are 3 types of notice that you could give if you're recording your deed or whatever you're recording. There's notice, race notice, and race. What do those things mean? Mm-hmm. And you might just throw up your hands and be like, I'll never be able to remember this. But that's another example. Not actually that hard.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the mailbox rule or something. You just got to know who gets to the recording first and what happens if you don't get there in time.
The other thing I think is really interesting is I feel like the language you hear when people are studying for the MBE, and I was guilty of this too, is, I can always get it down to 2, but then I can't pick the right one.
Right, which after doing this honestly doesn't make sense to me.
No, because
I'm like, there's a clear right answer.
Right, and I think that is something that a lot of people get caught up on. Now, some bar review providers, like maybe the largest one, I think even in their answer choices, because they write their own questions, sometimes will say, well, it seems like it could be both of these. But, the real MBE questions that are released, they've been vetted.
Yeah, there is a right answer.
There is a right answer, or else they couldn't use them to create a national test. And so you have to figure out what is the right answer. And when you come at it with an actual understanding of the law and applying that law, the right answer usually is very clear. Maybe there's still a few where you're scratching your head a little bit because they've got some tricky ones to try and trick you, but there is one correct answer.
Yeah, sometimes the answer, because what we suggest you do basically, we'll give you the, secret tip here to the MBE. Basically, we suggest that you treat the question like a hypo and formulate your answer first.
Right.
And when you do that, sometimes you have the correct answer that you might write in a hypo, but then they've switched it around. I remember a weird contracts question, which is not in the course, but is actually, I think, one of the things that gave us the idea for this course. And it was about, one of those FOB, freight on board or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the question really came down to where did the liability shift for this loss? So if you read the question, it was actually pretty straightforward. You're like, okay, this person brought it to the boat, and then as soon as they got to the boat, it went to this other person, and then they had the liability. But none of the answer questions revolved around that at all. Mm-hmm. And so there's this moment of where you're like, wait, what? But then you read them and realize oh, okay, they're just coming at this from completely 180 degrees.
Yeah.
But my actual logic is there.
Yeah.
But that's pretty rare.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I've seen going through a lot of, incorrect answers, which is, I think, one of the things that we often don't do when we study for the MBE is spend a lot of time reading why certain answer choices are wrong, because you can't just know what's right. You also need to understand why answers are wrong. And I think if I had to say the one thing that comes up over and over again in the course is this is a misstatement of the law.
Right, exactly. And that happens a lot in stuff, for example, con law. Mm-hmm. Con law, basically, a lot of it came down to do you actually know what level of scrutiny applies
and the
to
language and the very detailed
and
language.
What is the actual language of, what is the correct language to describe a level of scrutiny, and what level of scrutiny applies in this particular situation, whether it is, a religious test or whatever it is. They just test that over and over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. Really, most things, when you really dive into these, they are possible. Now, remember, the MBE, your goal is to get 70-some% of them right.
You're doing well at 70%.
You're doing really well at 70%.
We're not saying you have to get every question right.
No.
I'm just saying if you had infinite time and the ability to look up the law, you actually could get every question right. It is doable.
Absolutely. The other thing that we found when you really dig into this stuff, and this is how we organized our course, is that the NCBE actually tells you what are the most heavily tested areas of the law on the MBE. And so if you have limited time to study, they tell you where to start.
Right. And it's actually quite detailed. You can go look this up online. We can link to it in the show notes. It is, nobody's trying to hide the ball here.
Right.
They will tell you for each of these 7 topic areas, this is the approximate percent of questions that are going to come from these topics.
Yeah.
So you can look at something like evidence, and a huge percentage of questions are about relevancy and reasons for exclusion. And then another big chunk of them are about hearsay.
Yeah.
So by that time, you basically have covered the majority of the evidence questions. So, if you're studying other stuff, you kind of need to ask yourself why.
Right. If you're studying the law that's tested, maybe not every year because it's not even,
right. I mean, a lot of it's
covered.
like, 1/6 of the questions might touch on this huge list of topics.
Yeah. That should be your short list. Of
one
topics.
half is going to cover this fairly limited set of topics.
Yep. And the other thing I think that you can start to see when you really dive in is they oftentimes only have so many ways that they can test these nuances.
Oh, there are only so many rules.
Fair point.
I mean, it's like you can basically trick people by, it's one of those things like in evidence that maybe it matters if you're in a criminal case or a civil case. You just have to know that.
Right.
Maybe in contracts, it matters if you're in the UCC world or the common law world. You just have to know that. But, as with any of these things, there just aren't that many rules you can really formulate a question about. You're going to see the same ones. If you do enough MBE questions, you're basically going to have seen probably every single rule they could possibly throw at you.
Yeah. And if they throw you one or two that you don't know, you know enough of them that it's not going to matter.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, 98 out of 100, you're looking familiar. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So now that we've spent the last few months talking a lot about MBE questions at the Bar Exam Toolbox headquarters.
Yes.
HQ. What are we kind of taking to our students as the best way to prepare for the MBE?
Well, I think this is one thing that we have been recommending for a while, but I think are going to even put more emphasis on going forward, is when you're doing these questions, you need to really be tracking the law that covers the rules on things that either you miss or you're guessing on and you're not confident on. Because those rules are going to show up again, and you need to really be able to drill them and recognize them and, have them trigger in your brain when you see a similar fact pattern.
Yep. We call this the MMC, the missed multiple choice document.
Yeah, so this is literally a page. It can be on your legal pad or in your computer, but you just write down every single rule that applies to a question that either you're not sure about or you missed.
Yeah. And when you're looking at that rule, like let's go back to your con law example of like levels of scrutiny. If you just say, I missed, strict scrutiny, but like, what did you miss?
Right. Was it in the context of like a religious question?
Right.
Which type of religious question? There are 2 different types of religious stuff in the Constitution.
Right.
Like, you've got to be specific.
And did you miss like that it was not narrowly tailored? Like what is what was the language that you missed? What was, what tripped you up with the law? And that's what you really want to be tracking and studying.
Well, and I think you want the rule itself, too. I mean, I couldn't do the rule for, RFRA, whatever it is off the top of my head, but you need to be able to do that if you're taking the bar,
Yep.
Basically, that's the one of these religious ones requires that it be targeting this group, and so you need to be able to wheel off, and this will help you on the essays, too. If this comes up on an essay, fantastic, you just know the rule. But again, once you know these rules, the questions are not that hard.
Yeah.
You just have to know the rules.
So, I think as we already discussed, the other thing you have to keep in mind is that certain law maybe isn't even as complicated as it seems. I think that one of the things that can be helpful about, doing the course like ours or sitting with a group and, sussing out what some of this law and how it works is seeing how this law applies to facts can make the law make more sense.
Right, because you see, it's almost like an opportunity to test like mini essays too, because you see these facts appearing in a certain context over and over. And, if this topic shows up, if an evidence question shows up on, say, the essay questions, it's likely to look a lot like these MBE questions.
It's true.
They're just going to put like a bunch of them together and there might be 10 pieces of evidence instead of the one, but it's the same stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about mortgage recording on the drive to do this podcast because that's how dorky we are. and that's what I was working on yesterday. But I think that, one of the things that really struck me, especially given my anxiety over mortgage questions on the MBE, that is a hangover from now like a decade ago when I sat for the bar, that it's like, oh, well, if you just memorize the rules of these hard questions aren't very hard.
Right. I mean, the thing about the recording statute is that you have your notice, you have your race notice, and you have your race. You just need to know what each of those mean. You need to know what words trigger each one. And then for some of these questions, particularly in property, it can be helpful to do just a really quick diagram so you understand who the parties are, who got there first. And sometimes, again, when you do that diagram, things jump out at you and you're like, oh, well, that's not that hard. Sometimes they have all these people and the words, and you're just what's the relationship? I'm just going to skip this one.
Yep.
Other people just love to skip the property ones. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, if you do spend your 2 minutes on it, you oftentimes will find that that question wasn't really that hard. Mm-hmm. There was this person floating out there that seemed like they were really important, but as soon as you diagram it, you're like, well, they didn't have any claim for anything.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they don't get anything. You're like, duh. Whatever somebody gave them, they didn't have. You can't give somebody something you didn't have. I can't transfer Lee Trump Tower. I don't own Trump Tower.
Right, exactly. So, one of the other things that I think we realized as we were putting together this material is that sometimes different subjects need kind of their own little mini attack plan for the questions you ask when you get presented with a fact pattern. You mentioned this earlier with contracts. You always have to do are we in the common law or the UCC? And so when you are doing these questions, make sure that you have some sort of attack plan for these different subjects, because it's going to help you stay grounded and make sure that, you are thinking about all the things that need to be discussed.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of when you could have a chart, for example. Maybe you color code differences for certain things. You're such a
visual learner. You and your color coding.
Well, I'm just thinking, if you have your mailbox rule and you always put the UCC version in red and then you put the common law version in black. And then again, because you might be listening to this thinking, well, what difference does it make if I'm in, UCC or common law world? Well, if you went to law school, hopefully you realize that it might make a difference in certain areas.
Form contracts, that's another area.
Yeah. So, but again, it does not make a difference for everything, but it makes a difference for some things. So, keeping track of what those things are, which are very easy to test. Same thing in evidence. Does it make a difference if you are in a criminal court or a civil court? Well, in some cases, yes.
If you're talking about impeachment and prior bad acts and things like that, yeah, it does make a huge difference.
Yeah, certain things are allowed in civil cases that might not be allowed in criminal cases. So you need to know what those things are so that you don't get tripped up by them. And, maybe that's what people mean when they're like, well, there are two answers. It's like, well, they're not two answers because you're in one court or another.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Actually, this is totally irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that starting to see these, especially when you're doing kind of single subject practice, which typically in the beginning of your prep, you're just, doing a lot of common law questions and a lot of evidence questions as you get kind of immersed in this material. This is the time to look for those themes, to try and create these tables and charts and attack plans for yourself to start seeing how you can come up with a consistency of approach. I think that that's very important and something that you should keep in mind as you keep walking through these questions.
Yeah, because I think consistent approach is one way to increase your speed too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're not thinking about how do I answer this question, you're just like, oh, okay, step one, which universe am I in? Step two, what law applies?
Right.
That's how you're going to get faster.
Yeah. And I think, really utilizing that scratch paper, if you have, if you're one of those people, I'm one of those people where I can keep the image of the chart for future interest in my head, but I'm so much faster if I just sketch out, not spend 10 minutes sketching out, but create the boxes, and just make sure that I can quickly move through it. Then, you can also practice doing that on your scratch paper and getting very fast at it. So that might even up your accuracy more if you're not kind of trying to hold the picture in your brain and you're walking, through your list. You have to do what you need to do to make these questions accessible for you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's also okay when you start doing the study to slow down a little bit as you get more comfortable with these questions, but then you do need to get faster and work under those much more strict time conditions, especially in that month before the exam. But to dive in and really study off of these questions, I think in the beginning is not a problem.
No, and I think you should want to be cognizant of what you're using your study time for. So it's completely acceptable to spend 10 minutes on MBE questions if you're really diving in and learning that law. And maybe you go look up the law so you know exactly, if you kind of have an understanding of like, well, I see what the issue is, but I'm not sure what this law is. We'll go look it up.
Yeah.
And then that's different than when you sit down and do, say, a 100-question practice set or 30-question practice set. And there you're really looking more for, am I progressing? Am I staying on time? But so you can use them for different things. You just want to be kind of cognizant of what you're trying to do.
Yep. So I had the privilege of recording all of these videos.
Lily, what really stuck out for you in that recording?
I feel very close to this material. I think one of the things that really stuck with me as I was going through the hours and hours of these materials was just how the answer choices really make this much harder on you than it needs to be. I think if
sometimes they're so confusing.
Yeah, if the UBE was a short answer test, or if the MBE was a short answer test, I think it would be a completely different jam for most people. I think for me specifically, I think I am a sucker for a good distractor. And I think that, if you get caught up in trying to like evaluate each answer choice before you've really decided what the right answer to the question is, you're sunk.
Yeah, because they're really good at making you pick answers that sound right, but aren't right.
Yeah.
So yeah, we recommend, you read the question, don't even look at the answer choices unless it's one of those rare questions that, occasionally they'll ask you to evaluate,
the answer choices.
The answer choices, and then obviously look at them. But,
don't make up answer choices. And then
think about them. Well, they could be talking about assault, or they could be talking, just look at what the list is. But then, you go back to the question and really do that analysis before you start going through and trying to figure out what choice is which. Because if you do it that way, it's honestly so much easier.
Yeah. All right. So if people are worried about the MBE, or if they have failed already and the MBE is what is holding them back, we do have a few resources that we think are helpful outside of our Fabulous Practice of the Week course.
Which is very, very good. I'm just going to say it's really good. We're not patting ourselves on the back here, but it's actually, I think, a really great option.
Well, I wish I had done that work when I was studying for the bar.
No, it was totally eye-opening for me. And I'm good at multiple choice. I was like, wow, this just made this so much easier.
Yeah. But we also and are good friends with Adapt-A-Bar. We think that is a really great tool to do online practice. A lot of people push back against it because it is online, but the benefits you get from the reporting and the algorithms, I think, is kind of unmatched. And so you just kind of get uncomfortable and do it on the computer. You do everything else on the computer.
Yeah, it's not really that different, let's be honest.
Yeah. But, and with one of the things I think you can keep in mind when you do practice on Adapt-A-Bar is you can still have your scratch paper next to you. You can still be practicing, taking notes next to yourself, next to your computer.
And even highlight on the screen. And
exactly. There are ways to make it work for yourself. But it's important to also remember that Adapt-A-Bar says you got to do 2,000 to 2,500 questions a prep cycle to make a difference.
And not just do them, be doing them at 70% accuracy.
Well, yeah. But in the beginning, you're not going to be 70%.
Sure, but that's kind of their magic number. If people are looking for a magic number of what do I need to do to be okay on the MBE, if you do 2,000 questions and you're around 70% accurate, you're doing really well.
Yeah. So, I think it's a nice place. They use the real release questions. I think that's a good place to start.
Well, and it shows you too, which areas you're stronger or weaker in, which means, kind of where you need to drill down on some law usually is what's going on there.
Yep. We also like the Strategies and Tactics books by Manual, and they have some really good intro sections on different ways to approach the test. The questions are good. They're on paper if paper is super important to you.
Yeah, you can just buy the book.
Buy them on Amazon. I think that's a really great option.
Yeah, I've seen people really improve their scores a lot using those books. So I think it's a very good option.
Yeah, we've also got some helpful podcasts if you haven't listened to all the Bar Exam Toolbox podcasts yet. But I've done a few different episodes with Sean Silverman, who's an MBE tutor, and we walk through some questions. We talk more about the test. And I think that can also just be eye-opening to listen to people dialogue about these questions and see where, what is distracting about it, what are the pitfalls, and what our thought process is about it. So you might want to check those out. We will link to those in the show notes as well.
Yeah, because I think what you want to do is you need to do a lot of these questions until you can start to see the patterns and then accurately recall which rule applies to those patterns. So again, don't do them mindlessly, evaluate your work, track things you're missing, that kind of thing. But if you do enough of them and you're really paying attention, you're going to start to see these patterns.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I like your mention about not doing them mindlessly, because I think a lot of people get caught up in this idea.
Oh, just do them on the bus.
I'll do them, yeah. And they're just, or late at night, I hear, oh, I'll do the MBE practice at 11 o'clock in bed. And then your accuracy tanks. It's like, no wonder. I mean,
well, and also, when we build a study schedule for our students, we build in, say an hour to do questions and then 30 minutes to review the questions, so that you have, you're getting that feedback immediately and actually learning something from it versus just checking a box like, oh, I did 30 questions, moving on with my life.
Yeah. I really think that, downtime should be used for watching bad reality TV on your iPad like I was doing last night, watching 90 Day Fiancé.
Well, I was watching the Game of Thrones and then I couldn't sleep, so probably wouldn't recommend that.
90 Day Fiancé is much better and more conducive to sleep than watching Game of Thrones.
Yeah, the other thing I think sometimes people don't fully appreciate when they're studying is the MBE is about half of the test. Mm-hmm. And most people are not putting in half of their study time for the MBE.
Yep.
Why is that? I don't know. I don't think that's a good idea.
No, and I think that's because nobody likes it. I mean, I remember sitting in the MBE day and just being like, I cannot believe it's still going. It's so long. It's just so many questions. But you got to suffer through it. And the only way you can suffer through it is practice.
Well, and a lot of people, I think, never do a full set of even 100 questions.
Yeah, let alone 200.
Well, yeah, let alone 200.
Oh
it's like,
gosh.
by a week before the exam, I want you to be taking a full day of MBE questions. Does that sound horrible? Yes. What do you have to do on the bar exam? A full day of MBE questions. Better get used to it.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is tricky is that I remember getting really hungry during one of the sessions.
Oh, yeah.
And because you're like bored out of your mind because it's so boring. And you also have to practice like keeping yourself engaged and managing like if you get hungry. And then I remember thinking that I was mad that I was hungry because I must not have eaten enough breakfast. And why would the bar examiners not let me bring almonds? And, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I do not have time to think about this right now. I think I went to the bathroom. I like threw water on my face and came back and, pushed through.
Yeah. And I think I've talked to people who tell me like, oh, well, I'm so pushed on time. I can't possibly take a bathroom break or a water break. And then I get really tired and I lose focus for the last, hour of questions. It's like, well, I think it's going to be beneficial for you to take less than 5 minutes, which is like 2 questions. Yep. To walk across the room, splash some water on your face, go to the bathroom, like do some jumping jacks, do some meditation, do some yoga. I don't know, do your thing. Nobody cares if you're doing jumping jacks to get the blood flowing. But, you want to think about how are you actually going to approach these 3-hour sessions because they are a very long time.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we've been including in our tutoring courses, which I think a lot of people can experiment too, is the power of visualization. And so if you're like really struggling with this idea of what this would feel like, I think walking yourself through, especially if you are a repeat taker and you've had this experience of sitting for the 6 hours of the MBE and, visualizing, thinking about what it feels like, thinking about pushing through these things, I think that could be really, I don't know, major sports athletes do it all the time. So
yeah, definitely. And having a plan too, what are you going to do if you get a question and what if you get a string of questions and you have no idea how to answer them,
Yeah.
Because
what if you get hungry?
Yeah, what if you get hungry? What if you get tired? What if your foot falls asleep? What if your back starts hurting?
Yeah, or your hand because of the bubbling.
Yeah, or, they're all, oh my gosh, we hear so many stories about like misbubbling and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
That's one of those like pro tip here, never skip an answer.
Never skip an answer, just write something in.
Just put something in, circle it in your book. You can come back to it if you have time. Do not circle it on the Scantron sheet. But do not skip. And the other thing, which I remember doing, which I'm glad I did, is every like 5 to 10 questions, just doing a quick double check that I was on the right number.
Yeah.
Because, and also, so I'd circle the answer in my book in case I needed to go back to it and then do a quick double check every 5 questions or so. Like, am I on number 25? Because I think one time I wasn't, I'd like skip. It would have been totally disastrous.
Totally. So when I think, because we're almost out of time, when I think about the MBE, I think for me, when I first started working with bar students like 9 years ago or something like that, I think I kind of felt like the MBE was a lost cause for a lot of people. I think it was kind of like if you struggle with the MBE, like do what you can to get better, but really the writing is going to save you. And I think in California, you used to be able to do that when the MBE was not half the test. But now, games are changed. Pretty much everybody has the MBE being about half of your exam. And so you've got to figure this part out. Like you don't get to fail this one. You got to figure it out.
Yeah, you can't be getting like an 1100 on the MBE and expect to pass the California bar. Like that's just not numerically possible.
No. So you've got to figure out how to make this test work for you. And I think what the biggest takeaway that I learned from doing the Practice of the Week course, the POW course, was it is more possible than you might think.
I think that's absolutely right. That was my takeaway as well. I remember at some point slacking and being like, you know what? I just realized like none of these questions are actually impossible. Like I really don't think I believed that before. Like I believed that there were some I just never would have been able to get right. And I now see that that is not the case.
Yeah.
They are actually, believe it or not, pretty fair, just very nitpicky.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find more information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. And of course, check out the POW course for the MBE. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any other questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.